May 1945. Victory in Europe brings celebrations across Britain, but it also creates an enormous problem. The Royal Air Force possesses over 7,000 Lancaster bombers, the heavy four-engine aircraft that carried out devastating raids over Germany. Within months, most will be obsolete, too expensive to maintain, and unwanted in a world rapidly transitioning to jet power. A massive fleet that took years and billions to build suddenly has no purpose. The question facing the RAF and British government is simple but urgent. What do we do with thousands of Lancasters? As the war in Europe ended, Bomber Command stood at its peak strength. Production lines at Avro factories in Manchester, at Vickers facilities and across Britain had delivered approximately 7,377 Lancasters by the time the last rolled off the assembly line. These aircraft represented an enormous investment in materials, labour and engineering. Each Lancaster contained thousands of components, from Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to navigation equipment to defensive gun turrets. The bombers were scattered across Britain and occupied Europe. Dozens of RAF stations housed Lancaster squadrons that had flown their last combat missions. Aircraft sat on dispersal areas, in hangars and at maintenance units. Many showed the wear of operations, with battle damage, worn engines and airframes stressed by hundreds of hours over enemy territory. The immediate challenge was economic. Britain emerged from the war financially exhausted. The cost of maintaining thousands of heavy bombers in peacetime was prohibitive. Each Lancaster required regular servicing, fuel, spare parts, and crew training. The RAF's budget, inflated by wartime spending, faced drastic cuts as the government shifted resources toward reconstruction. Strategic realities compounded the problem. The Lancaster had been designed for nighttime area bombing, a mission the post-war RAF no longer prioritized. The aircraft lacked pressurization, making it vulnerable at the altitudes where jet fighters operated. Its defensive armament of rifle-caliber machine guns was obsolete against modern threats. Even its range, impressive for 1942, was insufficient for the global reach Britain's military planners envisioned. The jet age had arrived during the war's final years. Aircraft like the Gloucester Meteor demonstrated that piston-engine bombers belonged to the past. The RAF wanted jet bombers, jet fighters, and modern strategic aircraft. Lancasters represented the old war, not the new peace. Politics also influenced decisions. The British public, exhausted by 6 years of war, had little appetite for maintaining a massive bomber force. The destruction of German cities had become controversial. Questions about the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing campaigns meant the Lancaster carried uncomfortable associations. Keeping thousands operational would be a constant reminder of decisions many wanted to move beyond. By summer 1945, RAF planners had reached their conclusions. The vast majority of Lancasters would be declared surplus. Only those aircraft with specific roles or special capabilities would remain in service. The rest would be disposed of as quickly as possible. What became clear in those months after victory was that the Lancaster's combat career had ended. The question was whether these aircraft, which had carried the war to Germany night after night, would find any useful purpose at all, or simply be dismantled and forgotten. The Royal Air Force moved quickly to reduce its Lancaster fleet. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, squadrons began disbanding. Aircraft that had flown operational sorties days earlier were flown to storage facilities or designated for immediate scrapping. The speed of the reduction surprised even RAF personnel who had expected a gradual drawdown. Storage sites were established at locations like RAF Siloth, where hundreds of Lancasters sat wing to wing on dispersal areas. These aircraft were preserved against deterioration, their engines pickled, their systems drained, and their surfaces protected. The hope was that some might be returned to service if needed, though few believed this would actually happen. Other Lancasters went directly to scrap dealers. At sites across Britain, bombers arrived to be systematically dismantled. Workers removed engines, instruments, and valuable components first. Then they cut through the aluminum airframe, reducing each Lancaster to manageable pieces of metal. The aluminum was melted down and recycled, feeding Britain's reconstruction efforts. The scale of disposal was staggering. Hundreds of Lancasters were scrapped each month during late 1945 and 1946. Aircraft that had cost thousands of pounds to build sold for scrap value, sometimes just a few £100 per airframe. The economic calculation was brutal but clear. Maintaining them cost more than their material value. Some Lancasters met more dramatic ends. The RAF used surplus bombers as bombing targets, allowing crews to practice attacks against realistic airframes. Others were burned in firefighting training exercises. A few became ground instructional airframes at technical schools, teaching mechanics how to service aircraft systems. By 1948, the RAF had reduced its Lancaster force to fewer than 300 aircraft, down from over 7,000 just 3 years earlier. The majority had been destroyed, and only those with specific continuing roles remained on the inventory. The few Lancasters retained for operational use were converted for new missions. The aircraft's spacious bomb bay and long range made it suitable for roles that didn't require the latest technology. Maritime reconnaissance became the Lancaster's primary post-war mission. Coastal Command desperately needed long-range patrol aircraft to monitor Britain's extensive maritime approaches. Lancasters were converted to the GR3 standard, with maritime radar installed in place of bombing equipment. These aircraft patrolled shipping lanes, tracked submarines, and provided search and rescue coverage across the North Atlantic. The conversion process removed gun turrets, added radar equipment, and installed observation positions for maritime observers. The modified Lancasters could remain on patrol for over 8 hours, covering vast areas of ocean. These aircraft served into the early 1950s, supplementing purpose-built maritime patrol aircraft until sufficient numbers entered service. Another conversion produced the Lancaster ASR-3, optimized for air-sea rescue operations. These aircraft carried lifeboats in modified bomb bays, along with survival equipment and supplies. When aircrew ditched in the ocean or ships sank, Lancaster rescue aircraft could drop lifeboats directly to survivors, dramatically improving survival rates. The large internal volume that once carried bombs now carried life-saving equipment. Some Lancasters became aerial survey aircraft. The bomb bay accommodated cameras and survey equipment, allowing the aircraft to photograph large areas for mapping purposes. These Lancasters conducted surveys across Africa, Asia, and remote British territories, creating detailed maps of regions that had never been properly charted. Flight testing consumed several Lancasters. Aviation companies and government research establishments used the bombers as testbeds for new engines, avionics, and equipment. Their robust airframes could accommodate modifications that would be impossible on smaller aircraft. One Lancaster tested early jet engines mounted in the bomb bay, providing data that informed later jet bomber designs. The RAF also retained Lancasters for training purposes. Navigator schools used them to train crews in long-range navigation techniques. Radio operator schools used their communications equipment for instruction. Even as the bombers disappeared from frontline squadrons, they remained valuable as training platforms where their complexity and systems mirrored those of newer aircraft. These converted Lancasters extended the type's service life by several years, but they represented only a tiny fraction of those produced. Most Lancasters never flew again after 1945, moving directly from operational squadrons to storage or scrap. Britain wasn't the only nation interested in surplus Lancasters. Several countries acquired the bombers for their own air forces, though in limited numbers. France received Lancasters under post-war assistance agreements. The French Navy operated these aircraft for maritime patrol, using them to monitor coastal waters and support colonial operations in North Africa. French Lancasters served into the mid-1950s, longer than most RAF examples. Argentina purchased several dozen Lancasters in the late 1940s. The Argentine Air Force used them as heavy bombers and maritime patrol aircraft, taking advantage of the Lancaster's range to cover Argentina's extensive coastline. These aircraft remained in service until the early 1960s, among the last military Lancasters flying anywhere. Canada, which had built hundreds of Lancasters during the war at Victory aircraft facilities, retained a small number for maritime patrol and photo reconnaissance. The Royal Canadian Air Force operated these aircraft alongside their own indigenous designs, though they were replaced relatively quickly by more modern equipment. Egypt briefly operated Lancasters, acquiring them during the late 1940s. These aircraft saw limited service before being retired, though they reportedly participated in military operations during the Arab-Israeli conflicts. No country purchased Lancasters in large numbers. The aircraft's age and the availability of more modern designs limited international interest. Most nations preferred American surplus aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, or waited for new designs rather than investing in Lancasters. Civilian conversions were more successful. Several airlines converted Lancasters into transport aircraft, taking advantage of their range and payload capacity. The most famous conversion was the Lancastrian, a dedicated passenger and cargo version with a pressurized fuselage. British Overseas Airways Corporation and other airlines operated Lancastrians on long-distance routes during the late 1940s. These civilian conversions removed all military equipment, fitted passenger cabins or cargo holds, and modified the aircraft for commercial operations. While never produced in large numbers, Lancastrians demonstrated that the basic Lancaster design had commercial potential. Some Lancasters ended up in unusual civilian roles. A few became aerial firefighters in Canada, modified to drop water or fire retardant. Others were used for mineral exploration, carrying magnetometers and survey equipment across remote regions. Even with these various conversions and exports, the numbers were small. Perhaps 200 to 300 Lancasters found second lives in foreign service or civilian use. The vast majority of the 7,227 built never flew beyond their initial military service. Among the thousands of standard Lancasters, several deserved special mention. These aircraft had participated in famous operations or represented unique variants, and their fates varied. The Dambusters Lancasters from 600 to 117 Squadron held particular significance. The modified aircraft that carried Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bombs had attacked the Ruhr dams in May 1943. Most were lost during subsequent operations, but a few survived the war. These aircraft were quickly retired, with no thought given to preserving them as historical artifacts. By the time historians recognized their significance, most had been scrapped. Only one Dambuster aircraft survived in any form. Aircraft flown by pilot Joe McCarthy during the raid was eventually preserved, though not until after years in storage and partial dismantling. It became a centerpiece at the RAF Museum, one of the few physical links to the most famous bomber raid of the war. The Grand Slam Lancasters, modified to carry the 22,000-pound earthquake bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis, also disappeared quickly. These aircraft had reinforced airframes and modified bomb bays, making them unique variants. None were preserved, and all were scrapped or converted to other uses within years of the war's end. Several prototype and experimental Lancasters met similar fates. Aircraft that tested new engines, carried unusual equipment, or served as development platforms were scrapped once their testing programs concluded. In the rush to reduce costs and clear storage facilities, historical significance meant nothing. The speed at which special Lancasters disappeared reflected broader attitudes. In 1945, the war was recent history, not yet the subject of museums and preservation efforts. The bombers seemed common, with thousands available. No one imagined that within decades, complete Lancasters would become extraordinarily rare. A few aircraft escaped, scrapping through accidents of history. One Lancaster crashed in Norway during the war and was recovered decades later, eventually restored. Another sank in a Swedish lake and was retrieved in the 1980s. These chance survivals provided airframes for restoration projects that would have been impossible otherwise. By the 1960s, aviation historians and museum curators realized what had been lost. Attempts to locate complete Lancasters intensified, but very few remained anywhere in the world. The rapid replacement of Lancasters reflected the RAF's urgent need to modernize. Britain faced potential threats from the Soviet Union, which possessed growing numbers of jet fighters and modern air defenses. Lancasters were vulnerable to interception and couldn't perform the strategic bombing missions the RAF envisioned. The Avro Lincoln, essentially an improved Lancaster with more powerful engines and better performance, entered service in 1945. While still a piston-engine bomber, it offered superior range and payload. The RAF prioritized Lincoln production, viewing it as a bridge to jet-powered bombers. More importantly, Britain was developing jet bombers. The English electric Canberra, which first flew in 1949, represented the future. Fast, high-flying, and equipped with modern systems, the Canberra could penetrate defences that would shred a Lancaster formation. The RAF wanted Canberras, not 1942 vintage heavy bombers. Strategic priorities also shifted. The RAF evolved from a force focused on area bombing to one emphasizing precision nuclear strikes. This mission required aircraft with very different characteristics than the Lancaster. Speed, altitude, and electronic countermeasures became critical, none of which the Lancaster possessed. Budget pressures accelerated the replacement process. Every pound spent maintaining Lancasters was a pound unavailable for new aircraft or other defence. Priorities. The British government faced difficult choices about allocating limited resources, and keeping thousands of obsolete bombers operational couldn't be justified. The Cold War context also mattered. Britain needed to demonstrate to allies, particularly the United States, that it maintained a modern, capable military. Operating Lancasters into the 1950s would have signalled weakness and obsolescence. National pride demanded that Britain field contemporary equipment, not weapons from the previous war. By 1954, the last RAF Lancaster squadrons had disbanded. The maritime reconnaissance and rescue aircraft had been replaced by Shackletons and other specialised designs. The Lancaster's operational career in British service had lasted less than a decade beyond the war, remarkable given its wartime significance, but unsurprising given the pace of aviation development. Today, only a handful of complete Lancasters exist worldwide. The Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon preserves several examples, including the Dambuster aircraft. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum operates one of only 2 airworthy Lancasters, a remarkable achievement given the aircraft's complexity and age. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight maintains the other flying Lancaster. This aircraft appears at air shows and commemorative events across Britain, a living link to the bomber crews who flew thousands of missions. Watching it fly, with 4 Merlin engines roaring, provides a visceral connection to history that static displays cannot match. Museums across Canada, Australia, and Britain preserve static Lancasters. Each represents countless hours of restoration work, often using components salvaged from multiple aircraft. The scarcity of original parts makes every restoration a challenge, with fabrication of missing components sometimes necessary. These surviving aircraft are studied, photographed, and measured by researchers hoping to document details that would otherwise be lost. Every aspect, from control systems to crew positions to bombing equipment, provides insights into how these aircraft operated. The scarcity of Lancasters makes each surviving example precious. Less than 10 complete aircraft exist from a production run of over 7,300. The systematic scrapping of the 1940s means that what survives today represents a tiny fraction of what once filled British skies. Fragments occasionally surface: a Lancaster engine recovered from a crash site, a turret found in a barn, a section of fuselage discovered in a scrapyard. These pieces find homes in museums and private collections, expanding the physical record of an aircraft that once represented Britain's primary offensive weapon. Modern efforts to preserve aviation heritage have grown from the lessons learned with the Lancaster. Museums and preservation groups now move quickly to save historically significant aircraft before they're lost. The near-total destruction of Lancasters in the 1940s demonstrated what happens when preservation isn't prioritized. The story of Britain's Lancasters after 1945 is ultimately about rapid change and lost history. An aircraft that dominated Bomber Command for 3 years became surplus almost overnight. Economic pressures, technological advancement, and strategic shifts eliminated thousands of these bombers before anyone thought to preserve them. By the time historians and museums recognized what had been lost, very few remained to save. The handful that survived did so through luck, accident, or the determination of individuals who understood their significance. Modern aviation enthusiasts and historians work to ensure that surviving Lancasters are maintained and remembered. Each flying display, each museum exhibit, and each restoration project helps preserve the memory of the aircraft and the crews who flew them. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to British Spitfires after World War II next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.